Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Now, stress. I am not an expert on stress in the sense that I have researched it, but I am an expert on stress in the sense that I have experienced it for the entirety of my life. I've been living and working at universities my entire adult life, and for pretty much all of that, I've been a proper stress head. And in order to try and deal with that, I have done loads of reading and lots of listening and lots of thinking. And in this talk today, I'm going to summarize what I found, because one thing I found out very early on is that I'm not alone in being a bit of a stress head at university. It is quite a stressful environment. It arguably attracts stressy people such as myself, highly strung, as we used to be called back in the day. And so I think it's fair to sort of discuss from a tutor's perspective what sort of advice I would have to students, either prospective students or current students at universities, on how to just get a bit more of a handle on what's going on between our ears at any given moment. So let's get cracking. Let's start with some definitions, right? Classic academic way to start. You've got to make sure that everyone's on the same level playing field. So what even is stress? Well, this is super fascinating. I've really loved researching stress because it's so interesting. I mean, we could talk about this for hours and hours. And as I say, I'm not a biologist. I'm not a physiologist. I don't have particular nitty-gritty expertise on this, but there are some essentials that we can be clear about. So stress is typically a generalized reaction to a stimulus. In other words, the sort of reaction that we have is going to be the same regardless of the stimulus. So whether or not it is me, receiving some bad feedback for a piece of work I've done, or it's me about to be hit by a bus, I will have very, very similar reaction. I will have a massively sort of heightened heart rate. My blood vessels will start to open up so that my muscles can get more oxygen, so that I can get ready to run and fight and get into the thick of it and just survive, right? And interestingly, that generalized response is almost exactly the same response that your dog or cat will have if they are terrified by something, or that pretty much any animal has had, if it's a complex species, for the last like hundreds of millions of years. So the reaction I get when I open an email which is criticizing some of my work, is basically materially the same as the reaction that, a tiny vole would have had millions of years ago, which is, I don't know, is that depressing or does that somehow feel relatable? I'm not sure. You decide for yourself. Anyway, it's interesting. Stress is generalized, right? Even though the circumstances of stress are wildly different, right? If you are just feeling completely stressed out because you're struggling to get to the end of a computer game level, or if you are feeling down on yourself because you can't get your head around a particular maths puzzle, or as I say, if your life is actually at risk, it's the same, right? You've got the adrenaline coursing around, you've got the cortisol, you're feeling all agitated, your throat is going dry. It's generalized, right? Which is super fascinating. And what's actually happening is that the sympathetic nervous system, which is some nerves that go from the brain to those key organs that will get you ready to survive, triggers the fight or flight response. And when you want to calm down and have what's called the rest and digest response, then you need the parasympathetic nervous system. And these systems, sympathetic, parasympathetic, are called autonomic. Now, autonomic suggests that we have very little control over it, but we need to put a big fat asterisk on that, because sure, we can't control how much adrenaline we secrete, for example, but many of the stresses that we as human beings experience are psychological. Basically, they're in our heads, and so people react to those same stresses very, very differently. So whereas I might freak out if I get some poor feedback on a piece of work, other people will be much more just laid back about it and say, oh, well, that's okay, because there's another opportunity. I can do better next time. They won't have the same amount of adrenaline coursing around our bodies. It's a little bit like how differently people react to, say, horror films. Personally, I'm not a fan of horror films. They stress me out and I'll have nightmares for days. Okay. But some people love it, right? They think, they don't get that emotionally involved in it. They know that they're not about to be murdered themselves. So they can get lost in the silly fantasy of it. So that's the interesting thing about stress, is that although we kind of have no control over it, obviously to a certain extent we can shape how we react to these circumstances. We can get better prepared for the stresses. We can recognize the fact that they are often psychological rather than real causes of harm or potential harm, and so we can have a bit more control over it. Okay, and that's certainly something that I've come to learn as I've gotten older. So let's talk about common sources of academic stress, the sort of stresses that are likely to impact on us at university, at school, and so on. So what sort of stresses can we identify? Well, there are sort of proximate stresses, as I would call them. In other words, things that are, on a perhaps daily, even hourly basis can come up, which could include deadlines, fairly obviously, exams, peers, so how your friends and people around you are behaving. If they seem to be sort of streaking ahead academically, you might start to feel stress because you think, oh, I should be keeping up with them. There's an fascinating idea of imposter syndrome, which is this notion that you as an individual don't fit in, you don't belong in that environment. This is tremendously common at Oxford University. It's been estimated that upwards of 90% of students go through some form of imposter syndrome on a weekly basis, so feel that they probably shouldn't be at Oxford University. And then there's things like relationships and financial difficulties. These can all sort of cause up to daily causes of stress. Then there are sort of slightly more remote stresses, which could be sort of physically remote, but they could also be temporally remote in the sense that they are remote in time. They're not on the horizon, but they are in the background. They're sort of forming that hinterland of stress that can affect your mood. And so that could include your family, who might not live anywhere near you at university, but they are a presence. When you're thinking about, oh, I've just got this terrible feedback on an essay, what will my family think, right? If I fail my finals, what will my family think, right? That's a very common source of stress. And more generally, sort of social expectations. Will I get a job? Will I make my studies worthwhile? How will I be good enough? All these sorts of things. And then more generally, sort of thinking about the future. And this, of course, as far as we're aware, is a uniquely sort of human approach to stress. I mean, it's fairly likely that some animals are capable of anticipating some future events, such as whether or not they'll have access to food. But as far as we're aware, it's only humans that can worry about their career prospects, or whether or not they will impress that person that used to bully them at school, right? Pretty sure that there's no chicken out there who's getting freaked out by this. So it seems to be a uniquely sort of human source of stress. And a lot of what this sort of wraps around is this sort of generalized sense of inadequacy, that humans are particularly good at comparing themselves disfavorably to others, and especially very bright, very intelligent human beings. And that could be a consequence of what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is this psychological phenomenon which suggests that people who have highly attuned intellectual skills often significantly understate the extent of those skills. Whereas conversely, those people who have relatively weak academic skills massively over-exaggerate their abilities. In other words, people who are really super bright, committed, hardworking, and intelligent, they recognize the gaps in their knowledge, and therefore they are hyper-conscious of what they're not good at. And they are constantly sort of evaluating themselves negatively compared to other people, even though they are, by any other estimation, exceptional individuals. They always sort of think, yeah, but I'm not as good as that, and I can't do this. And a lot of it sort of wraps around this sort of sense of, well, maybe it's because I'm not built right. Maybe I'm sort of, I don't know, genetically deficient, or I wasn't born with the right setup or whatnot. And a lot of this sort of taps into this notion of IQ. And you would have seen from some other videos of mine that I have a full-on vendetta against IQ. I freaking hate the IQ test because of the psychic impact it has on people. In other words, because of the harm it does to people and their self-esteem. And that's largely because it doesn't really have much scientific basis for evaluating someone's intelligence. So it claims to tell you your intelligence quotient, but actually research seems to suggest that our intelligence is much more dynamic. It's much more capable of augmentation. So if we want to be brighter, we can put in some of our key resources to fix that. And a lot of the time, what could stop people from pursuing greater intelligence, greater skill, is the sense that there's no point because I'm not good enough. I'm just broken as a person, I'm deficient. There's actually very little scientific evidence that many people are broken in that sort of way. And therefore, for most of us, if we wanted to augment our abilities, we could. We just need to choose to do that. And so rather than being stressed and concerned about feeling like an imposter, we should just act decisively in order to fill any clear and reasonable gaps in our capabilities. Now, the reason for me going through all of this is because that's precisely my problem for my whole life. I've just thought I'm just not a good person for various reasons. And it took me a lot of effort to sort of push through that and say, well, no, I'm just going to keep trying and I'm going to read into this. And the more I read about it, the more I realized it was complete drivel and I was just abusing myself. So don't do it to yourself either. Okay, so how can you regain your perspective? Well, one thing that I found particularly helpful is recognizing that it's not all about you. You know, one thing that I was quite prone to in the past was sort of borderline narcissism. I wouldn't call myself a narcissist. You may think otherwise, it's up to you. But in the sense of every sort of hypothesis I have about my problems has me at the center of it. So I'm struggling with this particular bit of work. That's because I'm, inadequate, or, something's going wrong in a piece of a project that I'm working on with other people. That's because of me, right? Everything comes down to me, right? So it's a sort of very egocentric, very solipsistic analysis of causation. And that's actually very, very inaccurate in most cases. It's just not the case that individuals are responsible. Even for sort of very, very powerful individuals, it's rarely the case that you can just say it was all their fault, right? That's sort of getting into what sometimes used to be called the great man theory of history, that ultimately what happens or doesn't happen comes down to individual decisions. And in many cases, that's just not plausible. So you need to be clear as to, what realistically you are responsible for and how far it is your fault, right? Amazing line from Good Will Hunting, where Robin Williams says to Matt Damon's character, it's not your fault. And Matt Damon's character breaks down in tears, because that is the fundamental realization with a lot of stress, is that we put too much on our own shoulders. If you've got some poor feedback, you think that's because I'm inadequate, because I'm a dreadful human being, because I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other. But it's likely not your fault. And you can overcome this if you see it as a constructive opportunity to get better, rather than if you see it as further evidence of you being an inadequate human being. Okay, so try and sort of reassess your perspective and how central you are to all of these sources of stress. Okay, now how can you actually concretely alleviate stress? Well, so as mentioned, to a certain extent, stress is autonomic, so we can't sort of tell our adrenal glands to just stop secreting adrenaline. But you can do various things that can sort of trick the parasympathetic nervous system into calming everything down and getting us back into that rest and digest mode. One interesting approach, which has been pushed by Andrew Huberman and various other people, is the physiological sigh. Really fascinating. Basically, what you want to do is to sort of gently constrict your heart, gently, using your lungs. So you increase your lung capacity, which also increases the amount of oxygen in your body. And this has a double impact of sending messages to your brain that it's time to just sort of slow the heart rate down. It's time to reverse the fight or flight response. Okay, and the way to do that is to breathe in your nose relatively quickly. And human men suggest doing it twice, so having a sort of a top up, like, and then slowly out of your mouth. And it's important that the inhalation is faster than the exhalation, because this is what will trick the nervous system into thinking that everything needs to just be cooled down a little bit. So try it a few times. Inhale in your nose twice and out through your mouth slowly. Now you need to be relatively careful. It's worth doing that sat down. You can hyperventilate and get a bit lightheaded and dizzy. And you don't want to be doing it for 45 minutes necessarily, but you should see a fairly rapid return to just feeling a bit more calm and collected. It can also help you whilst you're doing that breathing to just remind yourself It's not all about me. This is not all my fault. This is not because I'm inadequate. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. Okay. So that sort of thing can help you then get through the initial stress response and work out a solution to it. Another thing to consider is what's known as Maslow's hierarchy of need, which is very famous, and it's you can see the diagram, triangular diagram of it. The hierarchy of need is the sort of fundamentals that a human being needs or feels that they need. And what can often happen is that sources of academic stress are coming at the top echelons of that hierarchy. So it's things like self-actualization and esteem. In other words, I want good feedback on this essay because it's about my identity, it's about who I feel I am, it's about my future plans, it's about my sense of self-worth. But a lot of the time we may be neglecting the lower levels of this pyramid to our significant detriment, and actually it's those lower levels that might be a significant source of our stress. So for example, it's all very well thinking about self-esteem and self-actualization, but are we getting enough sleep? Are we drinking enough water? Are we eating enough food? Are we just sort of making sure that we feel safe? So, do we have any money problems, right? Is there someone we can talk to help us with some of those sources of stress? Because the academic stuff is arguably sort of at a further reach of what we actually need on a daily basis. And we may be sort of exaggerating its importance and underestimating how important it is for us to just make sure that we are feeling comfortable and we have sufficient sleep and we have sufficient water and all of those sorts of real physiological fundamentals. In short, don't neglect the essentials. If you're feeling absolutely rubbish, then there are a few worse things you can do than have a good early night, and a good night's sleep will change your perspective on pretty much everything in my experience. Okay, so that's the sort of fundamental thing to do. And then to build out from that, and so you've done a bit of physiological sighing, you've thought about your breathing, you've recognized that you're not responsible for everything, that you're not sort of built wrong and you're not an inadequate human being, and you've audited all of those sort of fundamentals of how you're looking after yourself, sleep, food, etc. The next step is to remind yourself why you're doing this, right? A lot of people get stressed at university, despite the fact that they put loads of time and effort in trying to get there in the first place, right? So you've worked yourself hard at school, at college to get to a university, and now you're sort of hating it. But bear in mind, because you worked so hard, that proves for a start that you're not an imposter, right? Universities don't make mistakes. As someone who's involved in admissions at Oxford, we spend hours poring through the applications. We don't make admissions mistakes. That's the most confident you'll ever hear me, but we just don't. So, when you're feeling stressed, remember that, right? You're not an admissions mistake. You're there because you fulfilled the algorithm, right? You are good enough. So then you need to remember why you chose this university, why you chose this course, why you wanted to pursue this in the first place. What is your positive motivation? Why did you look through that course and think, this is what I would like to commit myself to, right? Try and remind yourself of the positive motivation for the things you're doing, because that will really help you develop your stress responses. Because then when you get some negative feedback, it won't be, oh my goodness, this is more evidence from the universe that I shouldn't be doing this course. It'll just be, okay, this is something I concretely need to work on so that I can get stronger, so that I can reconnect with this subject that I love, hopefully. Okay, I want to finish with a quote, which is in Japanese, and it goes as follows: Anzuru yori umu ga yasushi. Okay, and what this means is that it is easier to give birth than to think about it, which is slightly odd. Obviously, I don't know what it's like to give birth, but it's absolutely brilliant, because what it basically means is that just do it, right? If you think about difficult things, that's harder than the doing of the difficult things. So constantly worrying about what's going to happen in finals, what does this particular poor mark mean for my reputation, for my esteem, for my quality as an individual, worry, when what you could be doing is investing your resources in getting better, in reading more, in doing more practice papers, in solving more puzzles, in speaking to tutors who can help you out, right? It's the thinking about things that's harder than the doing. And hence in this old Japanese proverb, if you think so much about how difficult it's going to be to give birth, you'll be surprised at actually the reality is not so bad. Now, having not given birth, I don't wish to insult anyone out there who said, actually, it's terrible, which, obviously I wouldn't be able to comment on. But just as a proverb, I think it has a lot to recommend it. Anyway, I hope that's been vaguely interesting and useful. Do let me know about your experiences in the comments. Do let me know if there's anything that I can help with. And thanks so much for watching. All the best. Bye now.